Just a reminder that these videos that go on live like this, not all of them, when I'm teaching, I'm in the chat box and I'm also on video. But when I'm doing this at my own time and then I'm releasing them later, it doesn't mean that I'm going to be able to see what you're typing. I'm on vacation right now, so by the time you watch this, who knows where I could be. So I'm not being rude for not responding to the chat. Just so you know, I might just not be there. Okay. For those of you who have this book, this version of the book, it's page 46, the second paragraph. The first, on the top of the page, you have a little bit left from the previous paragraph. The first supper, there would be another one after midnight, was now being served, and Jordan invited me to join her own party, who were spread around the table on the other side of the garden. There were 3 married couples and Jordan's escort, a persistent undergraduate given to violent innuendo, and obviously under the impression that sooner or later Jordan was going to yield him up her person to a greater or lesser degree. Instead of rambling, this party had preserved a dignified homogeneity and assumed to itself the function of representing the said nobility of the countryside. East Egg condescending to West Egg and carefully on guard against its spectroscopic gaiety. "Let's get out," whispered Jordan. Whispered Jordan. Whispered Jordan after a somehow wasteful and inappropriate half hour. "This is much too polite for me." We got up, and she explained that we were going to find the host. I had never met him, she said, and it was making me uneasy. The undergraduate nodded in a cynical, melancholy way. The bar, where we glanced first, was crowded, but Gatsby was not there. She couldn't find him from the top of the steps, and he wasn't on the veranda. On a chance, we tried an important-looking door and walked into a high Gothic library paneled with carved English oak, and probably transported complete from some ruin overseas. A stout middle-aged man with enormous owl-eyed spectacles was sitting somewhat drunk on the edge of a great table, staring with unsteady concentration at the shelves of books. As we entered, he wheeled excitedly around and examined Jordan from head to foot. "What do you think?" he demanded impetuously. "About what?" He waved his hand toward the bookshelves. "About that. As a matter of fact, you needn't bother to ascertain. I ascertained. They're real." "The books?" He nodded. "Absolutely real. Have pages and everything. I thought they'd be a nice durable cardboard. Matter of fact, they're absolutely real. Pages and... Here, let me show you." Taking our skepticism for granted, he rushed to the bookcases and returned with Volume 1 of the Stoddard Lectures. "See?" he cried triumphantly. "It's a bona fide piece of printed matter. He fooled me. This fellow's regular Belasco. It's a triumph. That thoroughness. What realism. Knew when to stop too. Didn't cut the pages, but what do you want? What do you expect?" He snatched the book from me and replaced it hastily on its shelf, muttering that if one brick was removed, the whole library was liable to collapse. "Who brought you?" he demanded. "Or did you just come?" "I was brought. Most people were brought." Jordan looked at him alertly, cheerfully, without answering. "I was brought by a woman named Roosevelt," he continued. "Mrs. Claude Roosevelt. Do you know her?" I met her somewhere last night. I've been drunk for about a week now, and I thought it might sober me up to sit in the library. Has it? A little bit, I think. I can't tell yet. I've only been here an hour. Did I tell you about the books? They're real. You told us. We shook hands with him gravely and went back outdoors. There was dancing now on the canvas in a garden. Old man pushing young girls backward in eternal graceless circles. Superior couples holding each other tortuously fashionably and keeping in the corners. And a great number of single girls dancing individualistically or reliving the orchestra for a moment of the burden of the banjo or the traps. By midnight, the hilarity had increased. A celebrated tenor had sung in Italian, and a notorious contralto had sung in jazz, and between the numbers, people were doing stunts all over the garden, while happy, vacuous bursts of laughter rose toward the summer sky. A pair of stage twins, who turned out to be the girls in yellow, did a baby act in costume, and champagne was served in glasses bigger than finger bowls. The moon had risen higher, and floating in the sound was a triangle of silver scales, trembling a little to the stiff, tinny drip of the banjos on the lawn. I was still with Jordan Baker. We were sitting at a table with a man of about my age and a rowdy little girl, who gave way upon the slightest provocation to uncontrollable laughter. I was enjoying myself now. I had taken 2 finger bowls of champagne, and the scene had changed before my eyes with something significant, elemental, and profound. At a lull in entertainment, the man looked at me and smiled. "Your face is familiar," he said politely. "Weren't you in the 1st Division during the war?" "Why, yes, I was in the 28th Infantry. I was in the 16th until June 1918. I knew. I'd seen you somewhere before. We talked for a moment about some wet, gray little villages in France. Evidently, he lived in this vicinity, for he told me that he had just bought a hydroplane and was going to try it out in the morning. "Want to go with me, old sport?" "Just near the shore, along the Sound." "What time?" "Any time that suits you best." It was on the tip of my tongue to ask his name when Jordan looked around and smiled. "Having a gay time now?" she inquired. "Much better." I turned again to my new acquaintance. "This is an unusual party for me. I haven't even seen the host. I live over there." I waved my hand at the invisible hedge in the distance, and this man, Gatsby, sent over his chauffeur with an invitation. For a moment he looked at me as if he failed to understand. "I'm Gatsby," he said suddenly. So Gatsby finally appears. Yay! So, what happens with protagonists in books? Of course, I'm very open when it comes to literature. When I'm teaching literature, I ask of my students one thing: read. If you read the book, not just like, "Oh, I'm just going to lie down and not put it down until I'm finished with it." People who do that, and they brag about it too. "Oh, you're a slow reader. You're still on page 15. Just going through the pages and not really thinking about what you're reading, that's not reading. So I ask of my students, read the book. After that, when we do class discussions and I ask questions about the book and I give them themes to talk about, I want them to really enjoy the lines that are being read. I want them to think about the characters. I want them to think critically about what the character, for example, here, I was starting to talk about protagonists. Is Gatsby the protagonist of the story just because his name is on a front cover, just because his name is in a title? Or is Nick the person who's telling the story? Is he the protagonist? We've been with Nick from the very beginning, and it is now chapter 3, the middle of chapter 3, when we finally hear Gatsby's voice. So that's just something for you to think about. I am very open. If I ask a question, hey, do you think Gatsby is the protagonist or do you think Nick is the protagonist? Since we've been hearing his voice this entire time. And Gatsby only shows up in the middle of chapter 3. That's the first time we hear his voice, so to speak. So some students might say, I think Gatsby is the protagonist because it's the great Gatsby, right? The story revolves around his wealth. That's how we get started. Everybody has a connection to him. He has a great deal of importance in the story. And then I have a different student who raises his hand and says, no, Pollyanna, I think Nick is the protagonist because he's telling the story from the start. We're hearing about his experiences more than anyone else's. I would accept both answers. I don't know what other literature professors would do, but that's what I would do. And I want people to think about what they're reading. So, for instance, a lot has been made of the fact that this is a very rich party. Everyone is wearing their best clothes and they're eating good food and they're dancing and they're drinking, and every detail has been described. The wealth is being described. So wealth is obviously one of the themes in the story. But there's more to it. And each person is going to see it in a different way. And I'm open to hear what people have to say about their experiences with a novel. I read this book when I was 17 years old in high school. Later on in life, I decided to go to university to study literature and languages, mostly literature in English language. And people are like, oh, well, I read a book in English, and they wave copies of Harry Potter in front of my face, and I'm, all right, that's fun and exciting for people who like that sort of genre, and that's great. But when I talk about literature and classic literature that should be taught, I'm talking about Nathaniel Hawthorne. I'm talking about Mr. F. Scott Fitzgerald here. I'm talking about Toni Morrison, Alice Walker. I am talking about the great names. I want my students to really know the classics because throughout your life you will hear references. Well, let me put it this way. If you're interested in culture, literature, cinema, and certain aspects of TV, and now streaming is incredibly popular, there are references. Those references are deeply rooted in classic literature of good quality. So don't be waving copies of whatever book just because it's in English, then, oh, this is English literature. No, I'm talking about the classics first. Mark Twain. You have to read Mark Twain to understand the references to that period of time and how the relationship between, I don't want to give away too much. I'm not doing that book on here, but let us just not get into that. But there is a lot of reference to the Great Gatsby, and there have been made, I want to say. I know at least two versions. I saw the one with Robert Redford, but of course, well, no, of course, people who are younger will have seen the Matt Damon. Why do I keep mixing Matt Damon with Leonardo DiCaprio? Do they look alike? I'm completely deviating from the topic. But there are references in pop culture. For instance, Jane Austen is a fantastic writer. If you have ever seen the movies, the Bridget Jones movies, l- lines from Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice are thrown in. And unless you have read the books, you won't get the references, you won't get the dynamic. So it's literature has a life of its own, but it's the people who read who are really important. How you read and how you interpret what you read. Last school year that just ended in June, we did a literary project where some of my students decided to read a book, write a paper, and also do a presentation. Some of the presentations were so deeply rooted into bringing relevance to the themes from books like this. There are still today, they speak to people of all ages and people of all generations. So one of my students, I'm not going to say what her name was, of course not, did a piece about feminism. She talked about the women in The Great Gatsby, and I thought that was brilliant. And she took examples from the dialogue and how the man treated the women and how it was brilliant. And I wanted to hear what her experiences reading the book were. So I feel like that's more important than a right or wrong answer. Something to think about. And the video is now 17 minutes long. So I'm gonna wrap this up.